The Talla-Des Man-Eater by Jim Corbett. Part 1. Nowhere along the foothills of the Himalayas is there a more beautiful setting for a camp than under the flame of the forest trees at Bindukera when they are in full bloom. If you can picture white tents under a canopy of orange-colored bloom, a multitude of brilliantly plumaged red and gold minivets, golden orioles, rose-headed parakeets, golden-backed woodpeckers, and wire-crested drongos flitting from tree to tree and shaking down the bloom until the ground round the tents resembled a rich orange-colored carpet. Densely wooded foothills in the background topped by ridge upon ridge rising up from the Himalayas, and they in turn topped by the eternal snows. Then, and only then, will you have some idea of our camp at Bindukera one February morning in the year 1929. Bindukera, which is only a name for the camping ground, is on the western edge of a wide expanse of grassland, some 12 miles long and 10 miles wide. When Sir Henry Ramsay was king of Kumaon, the plain was under intensive cultivation, but at the time of my story there were only 3 small villages, each with a few acres of cultivation dotted along the banks of the sluggish stream that meanders down the length of the plain. The grass on the plain had been burnt a few weeks before our arrival, leaving islands of varying sizes where the ground was damp and the grass too green to burn. It was on these islands that we hoped to find the game that had brought us to Bindukera for a week's shooting. I had shot over this ground for 10 years and knew every foot of it, so the running of the shoot was left to me. Shooting from the back of a well-trained elephant on the grasslands of the Terai is one of the most pleasant forms of sport I know of. No matter how long the day may have been, every moment of it is packed with excitement and interest, for in addition to the variety of game to be shot, on a good day I have seen 18 varieties brought to bag ranging from quail and snipe to leopard and swamp deer. There is also a great wealth of bird life to ordinarily be seen when walking through grass on foot. There were 9 guns and 5 spectators in camp on the first day of our shoot that February morning, and after an early breakfast we mounted our elephants and formed a line with a pad elephant between every 2 guns. Taking my position in the center of the line, with 4 guns and 4 pad elephants on either side of me, we set off due south with the flanking gun on the right, 50 yards in advance of the line, to cut off birds that rose out of range of the other guns and were making for the forest on the right. If you are ever given choice of position in a line of elephants on a mixed game shoot, select a flank, but only if you are good with both gun and rifle. Game put up by a line of elephants invariably try to break out at a flank, and one of the most difficult objects to hit is a bird or an animal that has been missed by others. When the air is crisp and laden with all the sweet scents that are to be smelt in an Indian jungle in the early morning, it goes to the head like champagne and has the same effect on birds, with the result that both guns and birds tend to be too quick off the mark. A too eager gun and a wild bird do not produce a heavy bag, and the first few minutes of all glorious days are usually as unproductive as the last few minutes when muscles are tired and eyes strained. Birds were plentiful that morning, and after the guns had settled down, shooting improved, and in our first beat along the edge of the forest we picked up 5 peafowl, 3 red jungle fowl, 10 black partridges, 4 grey partridges, 2 bush quails, and 3 hares. A good sambar had been put up, but he gained the shelter of the forest before rifles could be got to bear on him. Where a tongue of forest extended out onto the plain for a few hundred yards, I halted the line. This forest was famous for the number of peafowl and jungle fowl that were always to be found in it, but as the ground was cut up by a number of deep nalas that made it difficult to maintain a straight line, I decided not to take the elephants through it, for one of the guns was inexperienced and was shooting from the back of an elephant that morning for the first time. It was in this forest, when Wyndham and I some years previously were looking for a tiger, that I saw for the first time a cardinal bat. These beautiful bats, which look like gorgeous butterflies as they flit from cover to cover, are, as far as I know, only to be found in heavy elephant grass. After halting the line, I made the elephants turn their heads to the east and move off in a single file. When the last elephant had cleared the ground over which we had just beaten, I again halted them and made them turn their heads to the north. We were now facing the Himalayas, and hanging in the sky directly in front of us was a brilliantly lit white cloud that looked solid enough for angels to dance on. The length of a line of 17 elephants depends on the ground that is being beaten. Where the grass was heavy, I shortened the length to 100 yards, and where it was light, I extended it to twice that length. We had beaten up to the north for a mile or so, collecting 30 more birds and a leopard, when a ground owl got up in front of the line. Several guns were raised and lowered when it was realized what the bird was. These ground owls, which live in abandoned pangolin and porcupine burrows, are about twice the size of a partridge, look white on the wing, and have longer legs than the ordinary run of owls. When flushed by a line of elephants, they fly low for 50 to 100 yards before alighting. This I believe they do to allow the line to clear their burrows, for when flushed a second time, they invariably fly over the line and back to the spot from where they originally rose. The owl we flushed that morning, however, did not behave as these birds usually do, for after flying 50 to 60 yards in a straight line, it suddenly started to gain height by going round and round in short circles. The reason for this was apparent a moment later, when a peregrine falcon, flying at great speed, came out of the forest on the left. Unable to regain the shelter of its burrow, the owl was now making a desperate effort to keep above the falcon. With rapid wing beats, he was spiraling upwards, while the falcon on widespread wings was circling up and up to get above his quarry. All eyes, including those of the mahouts, were now on the exciting flight, so I halted the line. It is difficult to judge heights when there is nothing to make a comparison with. At a rough guess, the two birds had reached a height of 1,000 feet, when the owl, still moving in circles, started to edge away towards the big white cloud, and one could imagine the angels suspending their dance and urging it to make one last effort to reach the shelter of their cloud. The falcon was not slow to see the object of this maneuver, and he too was now beating the air with its wings and spiraling up in ever-shortening circles. Would the owl make it, or would he now, as the falcon approached nearer to him, lose his nerve and plummet down in a vain effort to reach Mother Earth and the sanctuary of his burrow? Field glasses were now out for those who needed them, and up and down the line excited exclamations in 2 languages were running. "Oh, he can't make it. Yes, he can. Yes, he can. Only a little way to go now. But look, look, the falcon is gaining on him." And then suddenly only one bird was to be seen against the cloud. Well done, shabash, shabash. The owl had made it, and while hats were being waved and hands were being clapped, the falcon in a long, graceful glide came back to the simul tree from which he had started. The reactions of human beings to any particular event are unpredictable. 54 birds and 4 animals had been shot that morning, and many more missed, without a qualm or the batting of an eyelid. And now guns, spectators, and mahouts were unreservedly rejoicing that a ground owl had escaped the talons of a peregrine falcon. At the northern end of the plain, I again turned the line of elephants south and beat down along the right bank of the stream that provided irrigation water for the 3 villages. Here, on the damp ground, the grass was unburnt and heavy, and rifles were got ready, for there were many hog deer and swamp deer in this area, and there was also a possibility of putting up another leopard. We had gone along the bank of the stream for about a mile, picking up 5 more peafowl, 4 cock florican, hens were barred, 3 snipe, and a hog deer with very good horns, when the accidental, please turn your eyes away, recording angel, discharge of a heavy high-velocity rifle in the hands of a spectator sitting behind me in my howdah scorched the inner lining of my left ear and burst the eardrum. For me, the rest of that February day was torture. After a sleepless night, I excused myself on the plea that I had urgent work to attend to. Again, please, recording angel. And at dawn, While the camp was asleep, I set out on a 25-mile walk back to my home at Kaladhungi. The doctor at Kaladhungi, a keen young man who had recently completed his medical training, confirmed my fears that my eardrum had been destroyed. A month later, we moved up to our summer home at Nainital, and at the Ramsey Hospital I received further confirmation of this diagnosis from Colonel Barber, civil surgeon of Nainital. Days passed and it became apparent that abscesses were forming in my head. My condition was distressing my two sisters as much as it was distressing me, and as the hospital was unable to do anything to relieve me, I decided, much against the wishes of my sisters and the advice of Colonel Barber, to go away. I have mentioned this accident not with the object of enlisting sympathy, but because it has a very important bearing on the story of the Talla-Des Man-Eater, which I am about to relate. Part 2. Bill Baines and Ham Vivian were deputy commissioners of, respectively, Almora and Nainital in the year 1929, and both were suffering from man-eaters, the former from the Talla-Des man-eating tiger and the latter from the Chowgar man-eating tiger. I had promised Vivian that I would try to shoot his tiger first, but as it had been less active during the winter months than Baines's tiger, I decided, with Vivian's approval, to try for the other first. The pursuit of this tiger would, I hoped, tide me over my bad time and enable me to adjust myself to my new condition. So to Talla-Des I went. My story concerns the Talla-Des tiger, and I have refrained from telling it until I had written jungle lore. For without first reading jungle lore, and knowing that I had learned, when a boy and later, how to walk in a jungle and use a rifle, and the credulity of all who were not present in Kumaon at that time would have been strained, and after this, since all my previous stories had been accepted at their face value, was the last thing I desired. My preparations were soon made, and on 4th of April I left Nainital accompanied by 6 Garhwalis, among whom were Madhu Singh and Ram Singh, a cook named Ilahi, and a Brahmin Ganga Ram, who did odd jobs and was very keen to go with me. Walking the 14 miles down to Kothagodam, we caught the evening train and travelling through Bareilly and Pilibhit, arrived at noon next day at Tanakpur. Here I was met by the Peshkar, who informed me that a boy had been killed the previous day by the Talla-Des Man-Eater, and that under Baines's orders 2 young buffaloes, to be used as bait, had been dispatched for me via Champawat to Talla-Des. After my men had cooked and eaten their food, and I had breakfasted at the Dak bungalow, we started off in good heart to try to walk the 24 miles to Kaladhunga, not to be confused with Kaladhungi. The first 12 miles of the road through Baramdeo to the foot of the sacred Purnagiri mountain runs through forest most of the way. At the foot of the mountain the road ends, and there is the choice of 2 tracks to Kaladhunga. One, the longer, goes steeply up the left side of the mountain to the Purnagiri temples over a shoulder of the mountain and down to Kaladhunga. The other track follows the alignment of the tramway line made by Collier when extracting the 1,000,000 cubic feet of Saul timber that I have already spoken of. Collier's tram line, where it ran for 4 miles through the Sarda River gorge, has long since been washed away, but portions of the track he blasted across the perpendicular rock face of the mountain still remain. The going over this portion of the track was very difficult for my heavily laden Garhwalis, and night came on when we were only halfway through the gorge. Finding a suitable place on which to camp for the night was not easy, but after rejecting several places made dangerous by falling stones, we eventually found a narrow shelf where the overhanging rock offered measure of safety. Here we decided to spend the night, and after I had eaten my dinner, and while the men were cooking their food with driftwood brought up from the river, I undressed and lay down on my camp bed, the only article of camp equipment, excluding a wash basin and a 40-pound tent that I had brought with me. The day had been hot, and we had covered some 16 miles since detraining at Tanakpur. I was comfortably tired, and was enjoying an after-dinner cigarette, when on the hill on the far side of the river, I suddenly saw 3 lights appear. The forests in Nepal are burnt annually, the burning starting in April. Now, On seeing the lights, I concluded that the wind blowing down the gorge had fanned to flame the smouldering embers in some dead wood. As I idly watched these fires, two more appeared a little above them. Presently, on the left hand, one of these two new fires moved slowly down the hill and merged into the central one of the original three. I now realized that what I had assumed were fires were not fires at all, but lights, all of a uniform size of about 2 feet in diameter, burning steadily without a flicker or trace of smoke. When presently more lights appeared, some to the left and others farther up the hill, an explanation to account for them presented itself. A potentate out on shikar had evidently lost some article he valued and had sent men armed with lanterns to search for it. Admittedly a strange explanation, but many strange things happen on the far side of that snow-fed river. My men were as interested in the lights as I was, and as the river below us flowed without a ripple and the night was still, I asked them if they could hear voices or any other sounds. The distance across was about 150 yards, but they said they could hear nothing. Speculation as to what was happening on the opposite hill was profitless, and as we were tired out after our strenuous day, the camp was soon wrapped in slumber. Once during the night a ghurl sneezed in alarm on the cliff above us, and a little later a leopard called. A long march and a difficult climb lay before us. I had warned my men that we would make an early start, and light was just showing in the east when I was given a cup of hot tea. Breaking camp when only a few pots and pans had to be put away and a camp bed dismantled was soon accomplished. As the cook and my Gadwalis streamed off in a single file down a goat track into a deep ravine, which in Collier's day had been spanned by an iron bridge, I turned my eyes to the hill on which we had seen the lights. The sun was not far from rising, and distant objects were now clearly visible. From crest to water's edge, and from water's edge to crest, I scanned every foot of the hill, first with my naked eyes, and then with my field glasses. Not a sign of any human being could I see, or reverting to my first theory, was there any smouldering wood. And it only needed a glance to see that the vegetation in this area had not been burned for a year. The hill was rock from top to bottom. A few stunted trees and bushes growing where root hold had been found in crack or cranny. Where the lights had appeared was a perpendicular rock where no human being, unless suspended from above, could possibly have gone. 9 days later, my mission to the hill people accomplished, I camped for a night at Kaladhunga. For a lover of nature or for a keen fisherman, there are few places in Kumaon to compare with Kaladhunga. From the bungalow Collier built when extracting the timber Nepal gave India, the land slopes gently down in a series of benches to the Sarda River. On these benches, where crops grew in the bygone days, there is now a luxuriant growth of grass. Here, sambar and chital are to be seen feeding morning and evening, and in the beautiful forests behind the bungalow live leopards and tigers, and a wealth of bird life including peafowl, jungle fowl, and kaliga pheasants. In the big pools and runs below the bungalow, some of the best fishing in the Sarda River is to be had, either on a spinning rod with plug bait or on a light rod with salmon fly or fly spoon. At the crack of dawn next morning we left Kaladhunga, Ganga Ram taking the mountain track to Purnagiri and the rest of us the shorter way through the Sarda Gorge. Ganga Ram's mission, which would entail an additional 10 miles walk, was to present our thank offerings to the sacred Purnagiri shrine. Before he left me, I instructed him to find out all he could from the priests who served the shrine about the lights we had seen when on our way up to Talla-Des. When he rejoined me that evening at Tanakpur, he gave me the following information, which he had gleaned from the priests and from his own observations. Purnagiri, dedicated to the worship of the goddess Bhagavati and visited every year by tens of thousands of pilgrims, is accessible by 2 tracks. These, one from Baramdeo and the other from Kaladhunga, meet on the northern face of the mountain a short distance below the crest. At the junction of the tracks is situated the less sacred of the 2 Purnagiri shrines. The more sacred shrine is higher up and to the left. This holy of holies can only be reached by going along a narrow crack or fault running across the face of a more or less perpendicular rock cliff. Nervous people, children, and the aged are carried across the cliff in a basket slung on the back of a hillman. Only those whom the goddess favors are able to reach the upper shrine. The others are struck blind and have to make their offerings at the lower shrine. Puja, or prayer, at the upper shrine starts at sunrise and ends at midday. After this hour, no one is permitted to pass the lower shrine. Near the upper and more actual sacred shrine is a pinnacle of rock 100 feet high, the climbing of which is forbidden by the goddess. In the days of long ago, a sadhu, more ambitious than his fellows, climbed the pinnacle with the object of putting himself on an equality with the goddess. Incensed at his disregard of her orders, the goddess hurled the sadhu from the pinnacle to the hill on the far side of the snow-fed river. It is this sadhu who, banished forever from Purnagiri, worships the goddess 2,000 feet above him by lighting lamps to her. These votive lights only appear at certain times of the year. We saw them on April 5 and are only visible to favored people. This favor was accorded to me and to the men with me because I was on a mission to the hill folk over whom the goddess watches. That in brief was the information regarding the light which Gangaram brought back from Purnagiri and imparted to me while we were waiting for our train at Tanakpur. Some weeks later I received a visit from the Raval, or the high priest of Purnagiri. He had come to see me about an article I had published in a local paper on the subject of the Purnagiri lights, and to congratulate me on being the only European ever to have been privileged to see them. In my article I gave the explanation for the lights as I have given it in these pages, and I added that if my readers were unable to accept this explanation and desired to find one for themselves, they should bear the following points in mind. The lights did not appear simultaneously. They were of a uniform size of about 2 feet in diameter. They were not affected by wind, and they were able to move from one spot to another. The high priest was emphatic that the lights were an established fact which no one could dispute. In this I was in agreement with him, for I had seen them for myself, and that no other explanation than the one that I had given could be advanced to account for them. The following year I was fishing the Sarda with Sir Malcolm Haley, now Lord Haley, who was governor of the United Provinces at the time. Sir Malcolm had seen my article, and as we approached the gorge, he asked me to point out the spot where I had seen the lights. We had 4 Dhimas, fishermen, with us who were piloting the sarnis, or inflated skins, on which we were floating down the river from one fishing stand to the other. These men were part of a gang of 20 engaged by a contractor in floating pine sleepers from the high-level forests in Kumaon and Nepal to the boom at Baramdeo. This was a long, difficult, and a very dangerous task, calling for great courage and a thorough knowledge of the river and its many hazards. Below the shelf blasted out of the cliff by Collier, on which my men and I had spent the night when on our way up to Talla-Des, was a narrow sandy beach. Here the Dhimas, at my request, brought the sarnis to the bank, and we went ashore. After I had pointed out where the lights had appeared and traced their movements on the hill, Sir Malcolm said the Dhimas could possibly provide an explanation, or at least throw some light on the subject. So he turned to them. He knew the correct approach to make to an Indian when seeking information and could speak the language perfectly, and elicited the following information. Their homes were in the Kangra Valley, where they had some cultivation, but not sufficient to support them. They earned their living by floating sleepers down the Sarda River for Thakur Dan Singh Bist. They knew every foot of the river as far down as Baramdeo, for they had been up and down it countless times. They knew this particular gorge very, very well, for there were backwaters in it that hung up the sleepers and gave them a great deal of trouble. They had never seen anything unusual in this part of the river in the way of lights or anything else. As he turned away from the Dhimas, I asked Sir Malcolm to put one more question to them. Had they, in all the years they had been working on the Sarda River, ever spent a night in the gorge? Their answer to this question was a very emphatic no. Questioned further, they said not only had they never spent a night in the gorge, but that they had never heard of anyone else ever having done so. The reason they gave for this was that the gorge was haunted by evil spirits. 2,000 feet above us, a narrow crack, worn smooth by the naked feet of generations upon generations of devotees, ran for 50 yards across a perpendicular rock cliff where there was no handhold of any kind. In spite of the precautions taken by the priests to safeguard the lives of pilgrims, casualties while negotiating that crack were heavy until H.H. the Maharaja of Mysore provided funds a few years ago for the steel cable to be stretched across the face of the cliff from the lower shrine to the upper shrine. So there well might be spirits at the foot of that cliff, but not, I think, evil ones. Part 3. Now, to get back to my story. Ganga Ram, who could cover the ground as fast as any man in Kumaon, had stayed back with me to carry my camera, and we caught up with the cook and the 6 Gadwalis 2 miles from where we had spent the night. For the next 6 hours we walked with never a pause, at times through dense forests, and at times along the bank of the Sarda River. Our way took us through Galadhunga, and through Chuka to the foot of the mountain, on the far side of which was our objective, the hunting grounds of the Talla-Des Man-Eater. At the foot of the mountain, we halted for 2 hours to cook and eat our midday meal before essaying the 4,000-foot climb. In the afternoon, with the hot April sun blazing down on our backs, and without a single tree to shade us, we started on one of the most steepest and exhausting climbs my men and I had ever undertaken. The so-called road was only a rough track which went straight up the face of the mountain without a single hairpin bend to ease the gradient. After repeated and many halts, we arrived at sunset at a little hamlet 1,000 feet from the crest. We had been warned at Chuka to avoid this hamlet, for being the only inhabited place on the southern face of the mountain, it was visited regularly by the man-eater. However, man-eater or no man-eater, we could go no farther. So to the hamlet, which was a few hundred yards from the track, we went. The 2 families in the hamlet were delighted to see us, and after we had rested and eaten our evening meal, my men were provided with accommodations behind locked doors, while I settled down in my camp bed under a tree that sheltered the tiny spring which provided the 2 families with drinking water, with a rifle and a lantern to keep me company. Lying on my bed that night, I had ample time to review the situation. Instructions had been issued by Bill Baines to headmen of villages not to disturb any human or other kills pending my arrival. The boy, the Peshkar of Tanakpur, had told me about, had been killed on the 4th, and it was now the night of the 6th day. Since leaving the train at Tanakpur, we had not spared ourselves in an effort to try to get to the scene of the killing with as little delay as possible. I knew the tiger would have eaten out his kill before our arrival, and that, if he was not disturbed, he would probably remain in the vicinity for a day or 2. I had hoped, when leaving camp that morning, that we would reach our destination in time to tie out one of the 2 young buffaloes, but the climb up from the Sarda had been too much for us. Regrettable as the loss of 1 day was, it could not be helped, and I could only hope that if the tiger had moved away from the scene of his kill, he had not gone far. One of the disadvantages I had to contend with was that I did not know this part of Kumaon. The tiger had been operating for 8 years and had made 150 human kills, so it was reasonable to assume that he was working over a very large area. If contact with him was once lost, it would be weeks before it could again be made. However, worrying over what the tiger had done or what he might do was profitless, so I went to sleep. I was to make an early start, and it was still quite dark when Ganga Ram roused me by lighting the lantern which had gone out during the night. While breakfast was being gotten ready, I had a bath at the spring, and the sun was just rising over the Nepal mountains, when, having cleaned and oiled my .275 Rigby Mauser rifle and put 5 rounds in the magazine, I was ready to start. Inter-village communication had been interrupted by the man-eater, and the 2 men in the hamlet had not heard about the tiger's last kill, so they were unable to give me any information as to the direction or the distance we would have to go. Not knowing when my men would get their next meal, I told them to have a good one now and to follow me when they were ready, keeping close together and selecting open places to sit down in which they wanted to rest. Rejoining the track up which we had labored the previous evening, I halted for a spell to admire the view. Below me, the valley of the Sarda was veiled in shadow, and a wisp of mist showed where the river wound in and out through the foothills to emerge at Tanakpur. Beyond Tanakpur, the eye could follow the river as a gleaming silver ribbon until lost to sight on the horizon. Chuka was in shadow and partly obscured by mist, but I could see the path winding up to Thak, every foot of which I was to know when hunting the Talla-Des Man-Eater 10 years later. Thak village, gifted hundreds of years ago by the Chand Rajas of Kumaon to the priests who see the Purnagiri shrines, was bathed in the morning sun, as was also the pinnacle of Purnagiri. 25 years have come and gone since I turned away from that view to complete the last stage of my journey to Talla-Des, a long period of time in which much has happened. But time does not efface events graven deep on memory's tablets, and the events of the 5 days I spent hunting the man-eating tiger of Talla-Des are as clear-cut and fresh in my memory today as they were 25 years ago. On the far side of the hill, I found the track that I was on joined a quite good forest road some 6 feet wide, running east and west. Here I was faced with a dilemma, for there was no villages in sight, and I did not know in which direction to go. Eventually, on the assumption that the road to the east could only take me out of my way as far as the Sarda, I decided to try it first. Given the option of selecting my own time and place for a walk anywhere, I would unhesitatingly select a morning in early April on the northern face of a well-wooded hill in the Himalayas. In April, all nature is at her very best. Deciduous trees are putting out new leaves, each of a different shade of green or bronze. Early violets, buttercups, and rhododendrons are giving way to later primulas, larkspurs, and orchids. And the birds, thrushes, babblers, minivets, tits, and a host of others that migrated to the foothills for the winter are back on their nesting grounds and vie with each other in their joyous mating songs. Walking carefree and at ease in a forest in which there is no danger, only those objects and sounds which pleases the senses are looked at and listened to with any degree of attention, and all the other less arresting sights and sounds blend together to form a pleasing whole. When there is danger from a man-eating tiger, however, the carefree feeling gives way to intense awareness. Danger not only adds zest to all forms of sport, it also tends to sharpen the faculties and to bring into focus all that is to be seen and heard in a forest. Danger that is understood and which you are prepared to face does not detract in any way from pleasure. The bank of violets does not lose any of its beauty because the rock beyond it may shelter a hungry tiger, and the song of the black-headed sepia, poured out from the topmost branch of an oak tree, is nonetheless pleasing because a scimitar babbler at the foot of the tree is warning the jungle folk of the presence of danger. Fear may not be a heritage to some fortunate few, but I am not of their number. After a lifelong acquaintance with wildlife, I am no less afraid of a tiger's teeth and claws today than I was the day that a tiger shooed Magog and me out of the jungle in which he wanted to sleep. But to counter that fear and hold it in check, I now have the experience that I lacked in those early years. Where formerly I looked for danger all around me and was afraid of every sound I heard, I now knew where to look for danger and what sounds to ignore or pay special attention to. And further, when there was uncertainty where a bullet would go, there was now a measure of certainty that it would go in the direction I wanted it to go. Experience engenders confidence, and without these two very important assets, the hunting of a man-eating tiger on foot and alone would be a very unpleasant way of committing suicide. The forest road I was walking on that April morning ran through an area in which a man-eating tiger was operating and had been used by the tiger frequently, as was evident from the scratch marks on it. In addition to these marks, none of which was fresh enough to show the pug marks of the tiger which had made them, There were many tracks of leopard, sambar, bear, kakar, and pig. Of birds there were many varieties, and of flowers there was great profusion, the most beautiful of which was the white butterfly orchid. These orchids hang down in showers and veil the branch or the trunk of the tree to which their roots are attached. One of the most artistic nests I have ever seen was that of a Himalayan black bear made in a tree on which orchids were growing. A big oak tree had snapped off, either by weight of snow or in a storm some 40 feet above ground. Where the break had taken place, a ring of branches the thickness of a man's arm had sprouted out at right angles to the trunk. Here moss had grown, and in the moss butterfly orchids had found roothold. It was here among these orchids that a bear had made its nest by bending over and pressing down the branches onto the broken-off tree trunk. The trees selected by bears in which to make their nests are of the variety whose branches will bend without snapping. The nests have nothing to do with family affairs, and I have seen them at altitudes of 2,000 to 8,000 feet. At the lower altitudes, to which bears descend during the winter months to feed on wild plums and honey, the nests give protection from ants and flies, and at the higher altitudes they enable the animals to bask undisturbed in the sun. When a road is interesting, its length does not register on one's consciousness. I had been walking for about an hour when the forest ended and I came out on a grassy ridge overlooking a village. My approach over the open ground was observed, and when I reached the village the whole population appeared to have turned out to greet me. I often wonder whether in any other part of the world a stranger whose business was not known, arriving unexpectedly at a remote village, would be assured of the same welcome and hospitality as he would receive at any village throughout the length and breadth of Kumaon. I was possibly the first white man who had ever approached that village, alone and on foot, and yet by the time I reached the assembled people, a square of carpet had been produced, a morha or a rush seat placed on it, and I had hardly sat down before a brass vessel containing milk was placed in my hands. A lifelong association with the hill folk enables me to understand the different dialects that are spoken in Kumaon, and what is just as important, to follow their every thought. As I had arrived armed with a rifle, it was taken for granted that I had come to rid them of the man-eater. But what was puzzling them was my arrival on foot at that early hour when the nearest bungalow at which I could have spent the night was 30 miles away. Cigarettes passed round while I was drinking the milk, loosened tongues, and after I had answered the many questions put to me, I put a few of my own. The name of the village, I learnt, was Talla-Des. The village had suffered for many years from the man-eater. Some said 8 years and others said 10, but all were agreed that the man-eater had made its appearance the year that Bachi Singh had cut off his toes while splitting wood with an axe, and Dan Singh's black bullock, for which he had paid 30 rupees, had fallen down the hill and got killed. The last person killed at Talla-Des by the man-eater had been Kundan's mother. She had been killed on the 20th day of the previous month, which was March, while working with other women in a field below the village. No one knew whether the tiger was a male or a female, but all knew it was a very big animal, the fear of which was now so great that the outlying fields were no longer being cultivated, and no one was willing to go to Tanakpur to get the food that was needed for the village. The tiger was never absent from Talla-Des for long, and if I stayed with them, which they begged me to do, I would have a better chance of shooting it than anywhere else in Talla-Des. To leave people who place implicit trust in you to the tender mercies of a man-eater is not easy. However, my reason for doing so was accepted, and after I had assured the 50 or more people gathered around me that I would return to Talla-Des at the first opportunity, I bade them goodbye and set off to try to find the village where the last kill had taken place. At the point where the track from the hamlet met the forest road, I removed the sign I had placed on the road to indicate to my men that I had gone east, and replaced it on the road to the west, and, to ensure that there would be no mistake, I put a road closed sign on the road to the east. The two signs I have mentioned are known throughout the hills, and though I had not told my men that I would use them, I knew they would understand that I had laid them and would interpret them correctly. The first sign consists of a small branch laid in the middle of the road, held in position with a stone or a bit of wood, with the leaves pointing in the direction in which it is intended that the person following should go. The second sign consists of two branches crossed in the form of an X. The road to the west was level most of the way, and ran through a forest of giant oak trees standing knee-deep in bracken and maidenhair fern. Where there were openings in this forest, there were magnificent views of hills upon rising hills, backed by the snowy range extending to east and west as far as the eye could see. Part 4. After going for some 4 miles due west, the forest road turned to the north and crossed the head of a valley. Flowing down the valley was a crystal-clear stream, which had its birth in the dense oak forest on the hill that towered above me on my left. Crossing the stream on stepping stones and going up a short rise, I came out an open stretch of ground, on the far side of which was a village. Some girls coming down from the village on their way to the stream caught sight of me as I came out on the open ground, and they called out in great excitement, "The Sahib has come! The Sahib has come!" The cry was caught up from house to house, and before I reached the village, I was surrounded by an excited throng of men, women, and children. From the headman I learned that the name of the village was Talla-Kot, that a Patwari had arrived 2 days previously on April the 5th from Champawat to meet me and to tell all the people in the district that a Sahib was coming from Nainital to try to shoot the man-eater, and that shortly after the arrival of the Patwari, a woman of the village had been killed by the man-eater, and that in obedience to orders received from the Deputy Commissioner of Almora, the kill had not been disturbed. And finally, that in anticipation of my arrival, a party of men had been sent that morning to look for the kill, and if there was anything left of it, to put up a machan on it. While the headman was giving me this information, the party, numbering some 30 men, returned. These men told me that they had searched the ground where the tiger had eaten its kill, and all they had been able to find were the woman's teeth. Even her clothes, they said, were missing. When I asked where the kill had taken place, a lad of about 17 who was with the party of men said that if I would accompany him to the other side of the village, he would point out to me where his mother had been killed by the man-eater. With the lad leading and the throng of men, women, and children following me, we went through the village to a narrow saddle some 50 yards along, connecting 2 hills. This saddle was the apex of 2 great valleys. The one on the left, or western side, swept down towards the Ladhya River. The one on the right fell steeply away and down 10 or 15 miles to the Kali River. Halting on the saddle, the lad turned and faced the valley on the right. The left hand, or northern side of this valley, was under short grass with an odd bush scattered here and there, and the right side was under dense scrub and tree jungle. Pointing to a bush on the grassy side 800 to 1,000 yards away, and 1,000 to 1,500 feet below, the lad said his mother had been killed near it while cutting grass in company with several other women. Then, pointing to an oak tree in the ravine, the branches of which had been broken by langur monkeys, he said it was under that tree that they had found the remains of his mother. Of the tiger, he said, neither he nor any of the party of men with him had seen or heard anything, but that when they were on their way down the hill, they had heard first a ghurl, and then a little later a langur calling. A ghurl and a langur calling. Ghurl do occasionally call on seeing human beings, but not langurs. Both will call on seeing a tiger, however. Was it possible that a tiger had lingered near the scene of its kill, and on being disturbed by the party of men had moved off, and had been seen first by the ghurl and then by the langur monkey? While I was speculating on this point and making a mental map of the whole country that stretched before me, the Patwari who had been having his food when I arrived joined me. Questioned about the 2 young buffaloes for which I had asked Baines, the Patwari said he had started out with them from Champawat and that he had left them at a village 10 miles from Talla-Kot, where a boy had been killed by the man-eater on 4th of April within sight of the village. As there was no one on the spot to deal with the man-eater, the body had been recovered, and after a report of the occurrence had been sent to Champawat, from where it had been telegraphed to Tanakpur for my information, he had given orders for the body of the boy to be cremated. My men had not yet arrived from the hamlet where we spent the night, so after instructing the headman to have my tent pitched on the open ground near the stream, I decided to go down and have a look at the ground where the tiger had eaten his kill, with the object of finding out if the man-eater was male or female, and if the latter, whether she had cubs. This part of Kumaon was, as I have already said, unknown to me, and when I asked the headman if he could tell me the easiest way to get down into the valley, the lad who had pointed out to me where his mother had been killed and eaten stepped forward and said very eagerly, "I will come with you, Sahib, and show you the way." The courage of the people living in an area in which there is danger from a man-eater, and the trust they are willing to place in absolute strangers, has always been a marvel to me. The lad whose name I learned was Dungar Singh was yet another example of that courage and trust. For years, Dungar Singh had lived in fear of the man-eater, and only an hour previously he had seen the pitiful remains of his mother. And yet, alone and unarmed, he was willing to accompany me, an absolute stranger, into an area in which he had every reason to believe, from the alarm call of a kurul and a langur, that the killer of his mother was lurking. True, he had only recently visited that area, but on that occasion he had been accompanied by 30 of his friends, and in numbers there was safety. There was no way down the steep hillside from the saddle, so Dungar Singh led me back through the village to where there was a goat track. As we went down through scattered bushes, I told him that my hearing was defective, and that if he wanted to draw my attention to any particular thing, to stop and point to it, and that if he wanted to communicate with me, to come close and whisper into my right ear. We had gone about 400 yards when Dungar Singh stopped and looked back. Turning round and looking in the same direction, I saw the Patwari followed by a man carrying a shotgun hurrying down the hill after us. Thinking they had important information for me, I awaited their arrival and was disappointed to find that all the Patwari wanted was to accompany me with his gun-bearer. This, very reluctantly, I permitted him to do, for neither he nor his gun-bearer, both of whom were wearing heavy boots, looked like men who could move in a jungle without making considerable noise. We had gone another 400 yards through dense scrub jungle when we came out on a clearing a few hundred yards square. Here, where the goat track divided, one arm going towards a deep ravine on the left, while the other followed the contour of the hill to the right, Dungar Singh stopped and, pointing in the direction of the ravine, whispered that it was down there that the tiger had eaten his mother. As I did not wish the ground on which I wanted to look for pug marks to be disturbed by booted men, I told Dungar Singh to stay on the open ground with the 2 other men while I went down alone into the ravine. As I stopped talking, Dungar Singh whipped around and looked up the hill. When I looked in the same direction, I saw a crowd of men standing on the saddle of the hill where I had stood a little while before, with a hand stretched out towards us to ensure silence, and the other cupped to his ear. Dungar Singh was intently listening, occasionally nodding his head, and then with a final nod he turned to me and whispered, "My brother says to tell you that in the Viran field below you there is something red lying in the sun." A Viran field is one that has gone out of cultivation, and below us on such a field there was something red lying in the sun. Maybe the red object was only a bit of dry bracken or a kakar or young sambar, but it also might be a tiger. Anyway, I was not going to risk spoiling what might turn out to be a heaven-sent chance. So, handing my rifle to Dungar Singh, I took the Patwari and his man, each by an arm, and led them to a medlar tree growing nearby. Unloading the Patwari's gun and laying it under a bush, I told the two men to climb the tree and on pain of death to remain quietly in it until I ordered them to come down. I do not think any two men ever climbed into a tree more gladly, and from the way they clung to the branches after they had climbed as high as it was safe to go, it was evident that their views on man-eater hunting had undergone a drastic change since they followed me from the village. The goat track to the right led on to a terraced field which had long been out of cultivation, and on which there was a luxuriant growth of oat grass. This field, about 100 yards long, was 10 feet wide at one end and 30 feet wide at the other, where it terminated on a ridge. For 50 yards the field was straight, and then it curved to the left. As Dungar Singh saw me looking at it, he said that from the farther end we would be able to see down onto the Viran field on which his brother had seen the red object. Bending down and keeping to the inner edge of the field, we crept along until we came to the far end. Here we lay down and, crawling on hands and knees to the edge of the field, parted the grass and looked down. Below us was a small valley, with on the far side a steep grassy slope fringed on the side farthest from us by a dense growth of oak saplings. Beyond the saplings was a deep ravine in which the man-eater had eaten Dungar Singh's mother. The grassy slope was about 30 yards wide, and below it was a rock cliff which, judging from the trees growing at the foot, was about 80 to 100 feet high. On the near side of the slope was a terraced field, 100 yards long and some 10 yards wide. The field, which was in a straight line with us, had a small patch of short emerald green grass at our end. On the remainder was a dense growth of an aromatic type of weed which grows to a height of 4 or 5 feet and has leaves like chrysanthemums, the undersides of which are white. Lying in brilliant sunlight on the patch of grass and about 10 feet apart were 2 tigers. The nearer tiger had its back to us with its head towards the hill, and the farther one had its stomach to us with its tail towards the hill. Both were fast asleep. The nearer offered the better shot, and I was afraid that on hearing the smack of the bullet, the farther one would go straight down the hill into dense cover, in the direction in which its head was pointing. Whereas if I fired at the farther one first, the smack of the bullet, not to be confused with the crack of the rifle, would either drive the nearer one up the hill where there was less cover, or else drive it towards me. So I decided to take the farther one first. The distance was approximately 120 yards, and the angle of fire was not so steep that any allowance had to be made for the lift of the bullet, a point which has to be kept in mind when shooting downhill on the Himalayas. Resting the back of my hand on the edge of the field to form a cushion, and holding the rifle steady, I took careful aim at where I thought the animal's heart would be, and gently pressed the trigger. The tiger never moved a muscle, but the other one was up like a flash, and in one bound landed onto a 5-foot-high bank of earth that divided the field from a rainwater channel. Here the second tiger stood, broadside onto me, looking back over its right shoulder at its companion. At my shot it reared up and fell over backwards into the rainwater channel and out of sight. After my second shot, I saw a movement in the aromatic weeds which started close to where the dead tiger was lying. A big animal was going at full gallop straight along the field. Having started from so close to where the 2 tigers had been lying, this third animal could only be another tiger. I could not see the animal, but I could follow its movements by the parting of the weeds, the leaves of which were white on the underside. Flicking up the 200-yard leaf sight, I waited for the animal to break cover. Presently, out on the grassy slope dashed a tiger. I now noticed that the slope the tiger was on curved to the right in the same way as the field I was lying on curved to the left. As the tiger was keeping to the contour of the hill, this curve in the slope enabled me to get a near broadside shot at it. I have seen animals fall over a shot, and I have seen them crumple up, but I have never seen an animal fall as convincingly dead as that tiger fell at my shot. For a few moments it lay motionless, and then it started to slide down, feet foremost, gaining momentum as it went. Directly below it and within a few feet of the brink of the rock cliff was an oak sapling 8 to 10 inches thick. The tiger struck this sapling with its stomach and came to rest with its head and forelegs hanging down on side and its tail and hind legs hanging down on the other side. With rifle to shoulder and finger on trigger, I waited, but there was not so much as a quiver in the tiger. Getting to my feet, I beckoned to the Patwari, who from his seat on the medlar tree had obtained a grandstand view of the whole proceedings. Dungar Singh, who had lain near me, breathing in short gasps, was now dancing with excitement, and from the way he was glancing at the tigers and then up at the crowd of people on the saddle, I knew he was thinking of the tale he would have to tell that night and for many moons thereafter. When I saw the 2 tigers lying asleep, I concluded that the man-eater had found a mate, but later, when my 3rd shot flushed a 3rd tiger, I knew I was dealing with a tigress and her 2 cubs. Which of the 3 was the mother and which the cubs it was not possible to say, for all 3 looked about the same size when I had viewed them over the sights of my rifle. That one of the 3 tigers was the man-eater of Talla-Des there could be no question, for tigers are scarce in the hills, and these 3 tigers had been shot close to where a human being had recently been killed and eaten. The cubs had died for the sins of their mother. They had undoubtedly eaten the human flesh their mother had provided for them from the time they were weaned. This, however, did not mean that when they left the protection of their mother, they would have become man-eaters themselves. For in spite of all that has been said since Man-Eaters of Kumaon was published, I still maintain that the cubs of man-eating tigers in that part of India about which I am writing do not become man-eaters simply because they have eaten human flesh when young. Sitting on the edge of the field with my feet dangling down and the rifle resting on my knees, I handed cigarettes to my companions and told them I would go and have a look at the tiger that had fallen into the rainwater channel after we had finished our smoke. That I would find the tiger dead I had no doubt whatsoever. Even so, nothing would be lost by waiting a few minutes, if for no other reason than to give myself a little time to rejoice over the marvelous luck I had just met with. Within an hour of my arrival at Talla-Des, I had, quite by accident, got in touch with a man-eater that had terrorized an area of many hundreds of square miles for 8 years, and in a matter of a few seconds had shot dead the man-eater and her 2 cubs. To the intense pleasure that all sportsmen feel at having held a rifle steady when every drop of blood in one's body is pounding with excitement, was adding the pleasure and relief of knowing that there would be no necessity to follow up a wounded animal, a contingency that has to be faced when hunting tigers on foot. My men would not ascribe my good fortune to luck. To avoid the possibility of failure, they had consulted the old priest at the temple in Nainital, and he had selected the propitious day for us to start on our journey to Talla-Des, and evil omens when we had started had been absent. My success would not be ascribed to good luck. Therefore, nor if I had failed to shoot the tigers would my failure have been ascribed to bad luck, for no matter how well aimed a bullet might be, it could do no harm to an animal whose time to die had not come. The superstitions of those whom I have been associated with on shikar have always been of interest to me. Being myself unwilling to begin a journey on a Friday, I am not inclined to laugh at a hillman's rooted aversion to begin a journey to the north on Tuesday or Wednesday, to the south on Thursday, to the east on Monday or Saturday, or to the west on Sunday or Friday. To permit those who accompany one on a dangerous mission to select the day for the start of the journey is a small matter, but it makes all the difference between having cheerful and contented companions and companions who are oppressed by a feeling of impending disaster. The 4 of us sitting on the edge of the field had nearly finished our cigarettes when I noticed that the tiger that was resting against the oak sapling was beginning to move. The blood from the body had evidently drained into the forward end of the animal, making that end heavier than the tail end, and it was now slowly slipping down head foremost. Once it was clear of the sapling, the tiger glissaded down the grassy slope and over the brink of the rock cliff, As it fell through space, I threw up the rifle and fired. I fired that shot on the spur of the moment to give expression to my joy at the saucers of my mission to Talla-Des, and also, I am ashamed to admit, to demonstrate that there was nothing, not even a tiger falling through space, that I could not hit on a day like this. A moment after the tiger disappeared among the treetops, there was a rending of branches, followed by a dull and a heavy thud. Whether or not I had hit the falling tiger did not matter, but what did matter was that the men of the village would have farther to carry it now than it had remained on the slope. My cigarette finished, I told my companions to sit still while I went down to look at the tiger in the rainwater channel. The hill was very steep, and I had climbed down some 50 feet when Dungar Singh called out in a very agitated voice, "Look, Sahib, look! There goes the tiger!" With my thoughts on the tiger below me, I sat down and raised my rifle to meet the charge I thought was coming. On seeing my preparations, the lad called out, "Not here, but there, Sahib, there!" Relieved of the necessity of guarding my front, I turned my head and looked at Dungar Singh and saw he was pointing across the main valley to the lower slopes of the hill on which his mother had been killed. At first I could see nothing, and then I caught sight of a tiger going diagonally up towards a ridge that ran out from the main hill. The tiger was very lame and could only take 3 or 4 steps at a time, and on its right shoulder was a big patch of blood. The patch of blood showed it was the tiger that had crashed through the trees, for the tiger that had fallen into the rainwater channel had been shot in the left shoulder. Growing on the hill close to where I was sitting was a slender pine sapling. Putting up the 300-yard leaf sight, I got a firm grip of the sapling with my left hand, and resting the rifle on my wrist, took a careful and an unhurried shot. The distance was close to about 400 yards, and the tiger was in a slightly higher elevation than I was, so taking a very full sight, I waited until it again came to a stand, and then gently pressed the trigger. The bullet appeared to take an incredibly long time to cover the distance, but at last I saw a little puff of dust, and at the same moment the tiger lurched forward and then carried on with its slow walk. I had taken a little too full a sight, and the bullet had gone a shade too high. I now had the range to a nicety, and all that I needed to kill the tiger was one more cartridge, the cartridge that I had foolishly flung away when the tiger was falling through the air. With an empty rifle in my hands, I watched the tiger slowly and painfully climb to the ridge, hesitate for a few moments, and then disappear from my view. Sportsmen who have never shot in the Himalayas will question my wisdom in having armed myself with a light .275 rifle and only carrying 5 rounds of ammunition. My reasons for having done so were: A. The rifle was one that I had used for over 20 years and with which I was most familiar with. B. It was light to carry, accurate, and sighted up to 300 yards. C. I had been told by Colonel Barber to avoid using a heavy rifle and not to fire more shots than were necessary with a light one. With regard to ammunition, I had not set out that morning to shoot tigers, but to find the village where the last human kill had taken place, and if I had the time, to tie out a young buffalo as bait. As it turned out, both the light rifle and the 5 rounds would have served my purpose if I had not thrown away that vital round. My men arrived at the village in time to join the crowd on the saddle and to witness the whole proceedings. They knew that the 5 rounds in the magazine of the rifle were all the ammunition I had with me, and when after my 5th shot they saw the wounded tiger disappear over the ridge, Madhu Singh came tearing down the hill with a fresh supply of ammunition. The tiger on the patch of green grass and the tiger in the rainwater channel, which I found lying dead where it had fallen, were both nearly full grown, and the one that had got away wounded was quite evidently their mother, the man-eater of Talla-Des. Leaving Madhu Singh and Dungar Singh to make arrangements for the cubs to be carried up to the village, I set out alone to try to get in touch with the wounded tigress. From the bed of bracken onto which she had fallen after crashing through the trees, I followed a light blood trail to where she had been standing when I fired my last shot. Here I found a few cut hairs clipped from her back by my bullet, and a little extra blood which had flowed from her wound when she lurched forward on hearing my bullet strike the ground above her. From this spot to the ridge there was only an occasional drop of blood, and on the short stiff grass beyond the ridge I lost the trail. Close by was a dense patch of scrub 100 yards wide, extending up the side of a steep hill for 300 yards, and I suspected that the tigress had taken shelter in this scrub. But as night was now closing in and there was not sufficient light for accurate shooting, I decided to return to the village and leave the searching of the scrub until the following day. Part 5. The next morning was spent in skinning the cubs and in pegging out their skins with the 6-inch nails I had brought with me from Nainital. While I was performing this task, at least 100 vultures alighted on the trees, fringing the open ground on which my tent was pitched. It was these that brought to light the missing clothes of the man-eater's victim, for the cubs had torn the blood-soaked garments into strips and swallowed them. The men of the village sat round me while I was skinning the cubs, and I told them I wanted them to assist my Gadwalis in beating out the patch of scrub in which I thought the wounded tigress had taken shelter. This they were very willing to do. At about midday we set off, the men going through the village and along the saddle to the top of the hill and above the cover, while I went down the goat track into the valley and up to the ridge over which I had followed the tigress the previous evening. At the lower edge of the scrub there was an enormous boulder, from which I was visible to the men at the top of the hill. I waved my hat as a signal for them to start the beat. To avoid the risk of anyone getting mauled, I had instructed the men to stay on top of the hill and, after clapping their hands and shouting, to roll rocks down the hillside into the scrub I have spoken of. One cocker and a few colleague pheasants came out of the bushes, but nothing else. When the rocks had searched out every foot of the ground, I again waved my hat as a signal for the men to stop the beat and return to the village. When the men had gone, I searched the cover, but without any hope of finding the tigress. As I watched her going up the hill the previous evening, I could see that she was suffering from a very painful wound, and when I had examined the blood where she had lurched forward, I knew the wound was a surface one and not internal. Why then had the tigress fallen to my bullet as if poleaxed, and why had she hung suspended from the oak sapling for a matter of 10 to 15 minutes without showing any signs of life? To these questions I could not at the time, nor can I now, find any reasonable answer to. Later, I found my soft-nosed, nickel-encased bullet firmly fixed in the ball-and-socket joint of the right shoulder. When the flight of a high-velocity bullet is arrested by impact with a bone, the resulting shock to an animal is very considerable. Even so, a tiger is a heavy animal with a tremendous amount of vitality, and why a light .275 bullet should knock such an animal flat and render it unconscious for 10 to 15 minutes is to me inexplicable. Returning to the ridge, I stood and surveyed the country. The ridge appeared to be many miles long and divided into 2 valleys. The valley to the left, at the upper end of which was the patch of scrub, was open grass country, while the valley to the right, at the upper end of which the tiger had eaten the woman, had dense tree and scrub jungle on the right-hand side, and a steep, shaly slope edging in a rock cliff on the left. Sitting down on a rock on the ridge to have a quiet smoke, I reviewed the events of the previous evening and came to the following conclusions. A. From the time the tigress fell to my shot to the time she crashed through the trees, she had been unconscious. B. Her fall, cushioned by the trees and the bed of bracken, had restored consciousness but had left her dazed. And C. In this dazed condition she had just followed her nose, and on coming up against the hill she had climbed it without knowing where she was going. So the question that now faced me was, how far and in what direction had the tigress gone? Walking downhill with an injured leg is far more painful than walking uphill, and as soon as the tigress recovered from her dazed condition, she would stop going downhill and would make for cover in which to nurse her injury. To get to cover, she would have to cross the ridge, so the obvious thing was to try and find out if she had done so. The task of finding if a soft-footed animal had crossed a ridge many miles long would have been a hopeless one if the ridge had not had a knife edge. Running along the top was a game track, with an ideal surface for recording the passages of all the animals that used it. On the left of the track was a grassy slope, and on the right a steep shale scree ending in a sheer drop into the ravine below. Finishing my smoke, I set off along the game track, on which I found the tracks of ghurul, sarau, sambar, langur, porcupine, and the pug marks of a male leopard. The farther I went, the more despondent I grew, for I knew that if I did not find the tigress's pug marks on this track, there was little hope of my ever seeing her again. I had gone about a mile along the ridge, disturbing two ghurul who bounded away down the grassy slope to the left, when I found the pug marks of the tigress and a spot of dry blood. Quite evidently, after disappearing from my view over the ridge, the previous evening the tigress had gone straight down the grassy slope until she recovered from her dazed condition, and then had kept to the contour of the hill which brought her to the game track. For half a mile I followed her pug marks to where the shale scree narrowed to about 15 yards. Here the tigress attempted to go down the scree, evidently with the intention of gaining the shelter of the jungle on the far side of the ravine. Whether her injured leg failed her or whether dizziness overcame her, I do not know. Anyway, after falling forward and sliding head foremost for a few yards, she turned round and with legs widespread clawed the ground in a desperate but vain effort to avoid going over the sheer drop into the ravine below. I am as sure-footed as a goat, but that scree was far too difficult for me to attempt to negotiate, so I carried on along the track for a few hundred yards until I came to a rift in the hill. Down this rift I climbed into the ravine. As I walked up the 30-yard wide ravine, I noted that the rock cliff below the shale scree was from 60 to 80 feet high. No animal, I was convinced, could fall that distance onto rocks without being killed. On approaching the spot where the tigress had fallen, I was overjoyed to see the white underside of a big animal. My joy, however, was short-lived, for I found the animal was a sarau and not the tigress. The sarau had evidently been lying asleep on a narrow ledge near the top of the cliff, and on being awakened by hearing and possibly scenting the tigress above him, had lost his nerve and jumped down, breaking his neck on the rocks at the foot of the cliff. Close to where the sarau had fallen there was a small patch of loose sand. On this the tigress had landed without doing herself any harm beyond tearing open the wound in her shoulder. Ignoring the dead sarau, within a yard of which she passed, the tigress crossed the ravine, leaving a well-defined blood trail. The bank on the right-hand side of the ravine was only a few feet high, and several times the tigress tried but failed to climb it. I knew now that I would find her in the first bit of cover she could reach, but my luck was out. For some time heavy clouds had been massing overhead, and before I found where the tigress had left the ravine, a deluge of rain came on, washing out the blood trail. The evening was now well advanced, and as I had a long and a difficult way to go, I turned and made for camp. Luck plays an important part in all sport, and the tigress had, so far, had her full share of luck. First, instead of lying out in the open with her cubs, where I would have been able to recognize her for what she was lying out of sight in thick cover. Then the flight of my bullet had been arrested by striking the one bone that was capable of preventing it from inflicting a fatal wound. Later the tigress had twice fallen into a rock cliff, where she would undoubtedly have been killed had her fall in the one case not been cushioned by branches and a bed of bracken, and in the other by a soft patch of sand. And finally, when I was only 100 yards from where she was lying up, the rain came down and washed out the blood trail. However, I too had had a measure of luck, for my fear that the tigress would wander away down the grassy slope where I would lose touch with her had not been realized. and further, I knew now where to look for her. Part 6. Next morning I returned to the ravine, accompanied by my 6 Garhwalis. Throughout Kumaon, the flesh of sarau is considered a great delicacy, and as the young animal that had broken its neck was in prime condition, it would provide a very welcome meat ration for my men. Leaving the men to skin the sarau, I went to the spot from where I had turned back the previous evening. Here I found that 2 deep and narrow ravines ran up the face of the hill on the right. As it was possible that the tigress had gone up one of these, I tried the nearer one first, only to find, after I had gone up for a few hundred yards, that the sides were too steep for any tiger to climb, and that it ended in what in the monsoon rains must have been a 30-foot-high waterfall. Returning to my starting point, I called out to the men, who were about 50 yards away up the main ravine, to light a fire and boil a kettle of water for my tea. I then returned to examine the second ravine, and as I did so I noticed a well-used game track coming down the hill on the left-hand side. On the game track I found the pug marks of the tigress, partly obliterated by the rain of the previous evening. Close to where I was standing was a big rock. On approaching this rock I saw that there was a little depression on the far side. The dead leaves in the depression had been flattened out, and on them were big clots of blood. After her fall into the ravine, which may have been 40 hours earlier, the tigress had come to this spot and had only moved off on hearing me call to the men to boil the kettle for tea. Owing to differences in temperament, it is not possible to predict what a wounded tiger will do when approached by a human being on foot, nor is it possible to fix a period during which a wounded tiger can be considered as being dangerous, that is, liable to charge when disturbed. I have seen a tiger with an inch-long cut in a hind pad, received while running away, charge full out from a distance of 100 yards 5 minutes after receiving the wound, and I have seen a tiger that has been nursing a very painful jaw wound for many hours allow an approach to within a few feet without making any attempt to attack. Where a wounded man-eating tiger is concerned, the situation is a little complicated. For apart from not knowing whether the wounded animal will attack on being approached, there is the possibility, when the wound is not an internal one, of its attacking to provide itself with food. Tigers, except when wounded or when man-eaters, are on the whole very good-tempered. Were this not so, it would not be possible for thousands of people to work as they do in tiger-infested jungles, nor would it have been possible for people like me to have wandered for years through the jungles on foot without coming to any harm. Occasionally a tiger will object to too close an approach to its cubs or to a kill that it is guarding. The objection invariably takes the form of growling, and if the growling does not prove effective, it is followed by short rushes accompanied by terrifying roars. If these warnings are disregarded, the blame for any injury inflicted rests entirely with the intruder. The following experience, with which I met some years ago, is a good example of my assertion that tigers are good-tempered. My sister Maggie and I were fishing one evening on the Boar River 3 miles from our home at Talla-Des. I had caught 2 small mahseer and was sitting on a rock smoking when Jeff Hopkins, who later became conservator of forests of Uttar Pradesh, turned up on his elephant. He was expecting friends, and being short of meat, he had gone out with a .240 rook rifle to try to shoot a cocker or a peafowl. I had caught all the fish we needed, and so we fell in with Jeff's suggestion that we should accompany him and help him to find the game he was looking for. Mounting the elephant, we crossed the river, and I directed the mahout to a part of the jungle where cocker and peafowl were to be found in abundance. We were going through short grass and plum jungle when I caught sight of a dead cheetal lying under a tree. Stopping the elephant, I slipped to the ground and went to see what had killed the cheetal. She was an old hind that had been dead for 24 hours, and as I could find no marks of injury on her, I concluded that she had died of snake bite. As I turned to rejoin the elephant, I saw a drop of fresh blood on a leaf. The shape of the drop of blood showed that the animal from which it had come had been moving away from the dead cheetal. Looking a little farther in the direction in which the splash from the blood indicated the animal had gone, I saw another spot of blood. Puzzled by this fresh blood trail, I set off to see where it led to, and signaled to the elephant to follow me. After going over short grass for 60 or 70 yards, the trail led towards a line of thick bushes some 5 feet high. Going up to the bushes where the trail ended, I stretched out both arms. I had left my rod on the elephant and parted the bushes wide, and there under my outstretched hands was a cheetal stag, with horns in velvet, and lying facing me and eating the stag was a tiger. As I parted the bushes, the tiger looked up, and the expression on its face said, as clearly as any words, "Well, I'll be damned," which was exactly what I was saying to myself. Fortunately, I was so surprised that I remained perfectly still, possibly because my heart had stopped beating, and after looking straight into my face for a moment, the tiger, who was close enough to have stretched out a paw and stroked my head, rose, turned, and sprang into the bushes behind him, all in one smooth, graceful movement. The tiger had killed the stag among the plum bushes shortly before our arrival, and in taking it to cover he went past the dead hind, leaving the blood trail that I followed. The 3 on the elephant did not see the tiger until he was in the air, when the mahout exclaimed with horror, "Khabardar, Sahib! Sher hai!" He was telling me that it was a tiger and to be careful. Rejoining my men, I drank a cup of tea while they cut up the sarao into convenient bits to carry, and returned with them to the depression in which I had found the clots of blood. All 6 men had been out on shikar with me on many occasions, and on seeing the quantity of blood, they were of the opinion that the tigress had a body wound which would prove fatal in a matter of hours. On this point we were not in agreement, for I knew the wound was a superficial one, from which the tigress, given time, would recover, and that the longer she lived, the more difficult it would be to get in touch with her. If you can imagine a deep and narrow ravine running up the face of a steep hill, with the ground on the right sloping towards the ravine and well wooded but free of undergrowth, and the ground on the left-hand side of the ravine sloping upwards and covered with dense patches of ringal, which is stunted bamboo, bracken, and brushwood of all kinds, you will have some idea of the country my men and I worked over for the rest of that day. My plan was for the men to go up on the right-hand side of the ravine to keep me in sight by climbing into the highest trees they could find, and if they wished to attract my attention, to whistle. Hillmen, like some boys, are very good at whistling through their teeth. They would be in no danger from the tigress, for there was no cover on their side, and all of them were expert tree climbers. The tracks of the tigress, after she left the depression near the big rock, showed that she had gone up the hill on the left-hand side of the ravine. Up this hill I now started to follow her. I have emphasized elsewhere that jungle lore is not a science that can be learned from textbooks, but that it can be absorbed a little at a time, and that the absorption process can go on indefinitely. The same applies to tracking. Tracking, because of its infinite variations, is one of the most interesting forms of sport I know, and it can at times be also the most exciting. There are 2 generally accepted methods of tracking, one following a trail on which there is blood, and the other following a trail on which there is no blood. In addition to these 2 methods, I have also at times been able to find a wounded animal by following blowflies or by following meat-eating birds. Of the 2 generally accepted methods, following a blood trail is the more sure way of finding a wounded animal. But as wounds do not always bleed, wounded animals have at times to be tracked by their footprints or by the disturbance to vegetation caused by their passage. Tracking can be easy or difficult according to the nature of the ground and also according to whether the animal being tracked has hard hooves or soft pads. When the tigress left the depression, on hearing me calling to my men, her wound had stopped bleeding, and the slight discharge that was coming from the wound, owing to its having turned septic, was not sufficient to enable me to follow her, so I had to resort to tracking her by her footprints and by disturbed vegetation. This, on the ground I was on, would not be difficult, but it would be slow, and time was on the side of the tigress. For the longer the trail, the better the chances would be of her recovering from her wound, and the less chance there would be of my finding her, for the strain of the past few days was now beginning to tell on me. For the first 100 yards the trail led through knee-high bracken. Here tracking was easy, for the tigress had kept to a more or less straight line. Beyond the bracken was a dense thicket of ringall. I felt sure the tigress would be lying up in this thicket, but unless she charged, there was little hope of my getting a shot at her, for it was not possible to move silently through the matted ringalls. When I was halfway through the thicket, a cocker started barking. The tigress was on the move, but instead of going straight up the hill, she had gone out on the left, apparently onto open ground, for the cocker was standing still and barking. Retracing my steps, I worked round to the left, but found no open ground in that direction, nor did I appear to be getting any nearer the barking deer. The cocker soon after stopped barking, and a number of colleague pheasants started chattering. The tigress was still on the move, but turn my head as I would, I could not locate the sound. Pinpointing, that is, fixing the exact direction and distance of all sounds heard, is a jungle accomplishment which I have reduced to a fine art, and of which I am very proud. Now, for the first time, I realized, with a shock, that my accident had deprived me of this accomplishment, and that no longer would I be able to depend on my ears for safety and for the pleasure of listening intimately to the jungle folk whose language it had taken me years to learn. Had my remaining ear been sound, it would not have mattered so much, but unfortunately the drum of that ear also had been injured by a gun accident many years previously. Well, there was nothing that could be done about it now, and handicapped though as I was not going to admit at this stage of the proceedings that any tiger, man-eater or not, had any advantage over me when we were competing for each other's lives under conditions that favored neither side. Returning to the bracken, I started to try to find the tigress, depending on my eyes only. The jungle appeared to be well stocked with game, and I repeatedly heard sambar, kakar, and langur monkeys giving their alarm calls, and more than once I heard pheasants, jays, and white-capped laughing thrushes mobbing the tigress. Paying no attention to these sounds, which ordinarily I would have listened for eagerly, I tracked the tigress foot by foot, as, resting frequently, she made her way up the hill, at times in a straight line, and at times zigzagging from cover to cover. Near the top of the tree was a stretch of short, stiff grass about 100 yards wide. Beyond this open ground were two patches of dense brushwood, divided by a narrow lane which ran up to the top of the hill. On the short, stiff grass I lost the tracks. The tigress knew she was being closely followed, and would therefore expose herself as little as possible. The patch of brushwood to my right front was 30 yards nearer than the patch to the left, so I decided to try it first. When I was within a yard or two of the cover, I heard a dry stick snap under the weight of some heavy animal. I was positive on this occasion that the sound had come from the left, so I turned and went to the patch of brushwood from which the sound appeared to have come. This was the second mistake I made that day. The first mistake was calling to my men to boil the kettle for tea, for my men told me later that I crossed the open stretch of ground on the heels of the tigress, and that when I turned and walked away to the left, she was lying on an open bit of ground a few yards inside the bushes, evidently waiting for me. Finding no trace of the tigress in the brushwood on the left, I came back to the open ground, and, on hearing my men whistling, looked in the direction in which I expected them to be. They had climbed to the top of a tree a few 100 yards to my right, and when I lifted my hands to indicate that I had seen them, they waved me up up, up, and then down, down, down. They were letting me know that the tigress had climbed to the top of the hill and that she had gone down on the far side. Making what speed I could, I went up the narrow lane and on reaching the top found an open hillside. On this the grass had been burned recently, and in the ashes, which were still damp from the rain of the previous evening, I found the pug marks of the tigress. The hill sloped gently down to a stream, the one that I had crossed several miles higher up on the day of my arrival at Talla-Des. After lying down and quenching her thirst, the tigress had crossed the stream and gone up into the thick jungle beyond. It was now getting late, so I retraced my steps to the top of the hill and beckoned to my men to join me. From the big rock where I took up the tracks of the tigress to the stream where I left them there was a distance of some 4 miles, and it had taken me 7 hours to cover the distance. Though it had ended in failure, the day had been an interesting and exciting one, not only for me, who while doing the tracking had to avoid being ambushed by a wounded man-eating tiger, but also for my Gadwalis, who by climbing trees had kept both the tigress and myself in view most of the time. And it also had been a very long day, for we had started at daylight, and it was now 8 p.m. when we got back to camp. Part 7. The following morning, while my men were having their food, I attended to the skins, repegging them on fresh ground and rubbing wood ashes and powdered alum on the damp parts. Tiger skins need a lot of care, for if every particle of fat is not removed and the lips, ears, and pads properly treated, the hair slips off and ruins the skin. A little before midday I was ready to start, and accompanied by 4 of my men, I left the other 2 men in camp to attend to the soraos, the skin. I set out for the place where I had stopped tracking the tigress the previous evening. The valley through which the stream flowed was wide and comparatively flat, and ran from west to east. On the left-hand side of the valley was the hill on the far side of which I had followed the tigress the previous day, and on the right-hand side was the hill along which ran the road to Tanakpur. Before the advent of the man-eater, the valley between these 2 hills had been extensively grazed over by the cattle of Talla-Des, and in consequence the ground was crisscrossed by a maze of cattle paths and cut up with narrow eroded water channels. Dotted about the valley were open glades of varying sizes surrounded by dense scrub and tree jungle. Good ground on which to hunt sambar, kakar, and bear, all of whose tracks were to be seen on the cattle paths, but not the ground one would select on which to hunt a man-eating tiger. The hill on the left commanded an extensive view of the valley below, so I spaced my men in trees along the crest at intervals of 200 yards to keep a lookout and to be on hand in case they were needed. I then went down to the spot where I had left the tracks of the tigress the previous evening. I had wounded the tigress on 7th of April, and it was now the 10th. As a general rule of thumb, a tiger is not considered to be dangerous, that is, liable to charge at sight 24 hours after being wounded. A lot depends on the nature of the wound, however, and on the temper of the wounded individuals. 24 hours after receiving a light flesh wound, a tiger usually moves away on being approached, whereas a tiger with a painful body wound might continue to be dangerous for several days. I did not know the nature of the wound the tigress was suffering from, and as she had made no attempt to attack me the previous day, I believed I could now ignore the fact that she was wounded and look upon her only as a man-eater, and a very hungry man-eater at that, for she had eaten nothing since killing the woman whom she had shared with the cubs. Where the tigress had crossed the stream there was a channel, 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, washed out by rainwater. Up this channel, which was bordered by dense brushwood, the tigress had gone. Following her tracks, I came to a cattle path. Here she had left the channel and gone along the path to the right. 300 yards along was a tree with heavy foliage and under this tree the tigress had lain all night. Her wound had troubled her, and she had tossed about, but on the leaves on which she had been lying there was neither blood nor any discharge from her wound. From this point on, I followed her fresh tracks, taking every precaution not to walk into an ambush. By evening, I had tracked her for several miles along cattle paths, water channels, and game tracks, without having set eyes on so much as the tip of her tail. At sunset, I collected my men, and as we returned to camp, they told me that they had been able to follow the movements of the tigress through the jungle by the animals and birds that had called at her, but that they too had seen nothing of her. When hunting unwounded man-eating tigers, the greatest danger when walking into the wind is of an attack from behind, and to a lesser extent from either side. When the wind is from behind, the danger is from either side. In the same way, if the wind is blowing from the right, the danger is from the left and from behind, and if blowing from the left, the danger is from the right and from behind. In none of these cases is there any appreciable danger of an attack from in front, for in my experience, all unwounded tigers, whether man-eaters or not, are disinclined to make a head-on attack. Under normal conditions, man-eating tigers limit the range of their attack to the distance they can spring, and for this reason they are more difficult to cope with than wounded tigers, who invariably launch an attack from a little distance, maybe only 10 or 20 yards, but possibly as much as 100 yards. This means that whereas the former have to be dealt with in a matter of split seconds, the latter give one time to raise a rifle and align the sights. In either case, it means rapid shooting and a fervent prayer that an ounce or two of lead will stop a few 100 pounds of muscle and bone. In the case of the tigress I was hunting, I knew that her wound would not admit of her springing, and that if I kept out of her reach, I would be comparatively safe. The possibility that she had recovered from her wound in the 4 days that had elapsed since I had seen her had, however, to be taken into account. When, therefore, I started out alone on the morning of 11th of April to take up the tracks where I had left them the previous evening, I resolved to keep clear of any rock, bush, tree, or other object behind which the tigress might be lying up in wait for me. She had been moving the previous evening in the direction of the Tanakpur road. I again found where she had spent the night, this time on a soft bed of dry grass, and from this point I followed her fresh tracks. Avoiding dense cover, possibly because she could not move through it silently, she was keeping to water channels and game tracks, and it became apparent that she was not moving about aimlessly, but was looking for something to kill and eat. Presently, in one of these water channels, she found and killed a few weeks old kakar. She had come on the young deer as it was lying asleep in the sun on a bed of sand, and had eaten every scrap of it, rejecting nothing but the tiny hooves. I was now only a minute or two behind her, and knowing that the morsel would have done no more than whet her appetite, I redoubled my precautions. In places the channels and game tracks to which the tigress was keeping twisted and turned and ran through dense cover or past rocks. Had my condition been normal, I would have followed on her footsteps and possibly been able to catch up with her, but unfortunately I was far from normal. The swelling on my head, face, and neck had now increased to such proportions that I was no longer able to keep my head up or down and from side to side, and my left eye was closed. However, I still had one good eye, fortunately my right one, and I could still hear a little. During the whole of that day I followed the tigress without seeing her, and without, I believe, her seeing me. Where she had gone along water channels, game tracks, or cattle paths that ran through dense cover, I skirted round the cover and picked up her pug marks on the far side. Not knowing the ground was a very great handicap, for not only did it necessitate walking more miles than I need have done, but it also prevented my anticipating the movements of the tigress and ambushing her. When I finally gave up the chase for the day, the tigress was moving up the valley in the direction of the village. Back in camp, I realized that the bad time I had foreseen and dreaded was approaching. Electric shocks were stabbing through the enormous abscess, and the hammer blows were increasing in intensity. Sleepless nights and a diet of tea had made a coward of me, and I could not face the prospect of sitting on my bed through another long night, racked with pain and waiting for something I knew not what to happen. I had come to Talla-Des to try to rid the hill people of the terror that menaced them and to tide over my bad time, and all that I had accomplished so far was to make their condition worse. Deprived of the ability to secure her natural prey, the tigress who in 8 years had only killed 150 people would now, unless she recovered from her wound, look to her easiest prey, human beings, to provide her with most of the food she needed. There was therefore an account to be settled between the tigress and myself, and that night was as suitable a time as any to settle it. Calling for a cup of tea, made hill fashion with milk, which served me as dinner, I drank it while standing in the moonlight. Then, calling my 8 men together, I instructed them to wait for me in the village until the following evening, and if I did not return by then, to pick up my things and start early the next morning for Nainital. Having done this, I picked up my rifle from where I put it on my bed and headed down the valley. My men, all of whom had been with me for years, said not a word either to ask me where I was going or to try to dissuade me from going. They just stood silent in a group and watched me walk away. Maybe the glint I saw on their cheeks was only imagination, or maybe it was only the reflection of the moon. Anyway, when I looked back, not a man had moved. They were just standing in a group as I had left them. Part 8. One of my most pleasant recollections of the days when I was young are the moonlight walks along forest roads that 10 or a dozen of us used to take during the winter months, and the high teas we consumed on our return home. These walks tended to dispel all the fears that assail a human being in a forest at night, and further, they made us familiar with the sounds to be heard in a forest by night. Later, years of experience added to my confidence and to my knowledge. When therefore I left my camp on the night of April the 11th, in brilliant moonlight, to try conclusions with the Talla-Des Man-Eating tigress, I did not set out with any feeling of inferiority on what might appear to have been a suicidal quest. I have been interested in tigers from as far back as I can remember, and having spent most of my life in an area in which they were plentiful, I have had ample opportunities of observing them. My ambition when I was very young was to see a tiger, just that and no more. Later, my ambition was to shoot a tiger, and this I accomplished on foot with an old army rifle which I bought for 50 rupees from a seafaring man who I am inclined to think had stolen it and converted it into a sporting rifle. Later still, it was my ambition to photograph a tiger. In the course of time, all 3 of these ambitions were fulfilled. It was while trying to photograph tigers that I learned the little I know about them, having been favored by government with the freedom of the forests, a favor which I very greatly appreciate and which I shared with only one other sportsman in India. I was able to move about without let or hindrance in those forests in which tigers were most plentiful. Watching tigers for days or weeks on end, and on one occasion for 4.5 months, I was able to learn a little about their habits, and in particular their method of approaching and of killing their victims. A tiger does not run down its prey. It either lies in wait or stalks it. In either case, contact with its victim is made by a single spring or by a rush of a few yards followed by a spring. If therefore an animal avoids passing within striking distance of a tiger, avoids being stalked, and reacts instantly to danger, whether conveyed by sight, scent, or by hearing, it has a reasonable chance of living to an old age. Civilization has deprived human beings of the keen senses of scent and hearing enjoyed by other animals, and when a human being is menaced by a man-eating tiger, he has to depend for his safety almost entirely on sight. When restlessness and pain compelled me to be on the move that night, I was handicapped to the extent that I only had one effective eye. But against this handicap was the knowledge that the tigress could do me no harm if I kept out of her reach, whereas I could kill her from a distance. My instructions, therefore, to my men to go back to Nainital if I thought I could not cope with the tigress, but because I failed to return by the following evening, were not given, since I feared there was a possibility of my becoming unconscious and unable to defend myself. One of the advantages of making detailed mental maps of ground covered is that finding the way back to any given spot presents no difficulty. Picking up the pug marks of my quarry where I had left them, I resumed my tracking, which was now only possible on game tracks and on cattle paths, to which the tigress was fortunately keeping. Sambhar and Kakar had now come out to the open glades, some to feed and others for protection, and though I could not pinpoint their alarm calls, for they let me know when the tigress was on the move and gave me a rough idea of the direction in which she was moving. On a narrow, winding cattle path running through dense cover, I left the pug marks of the tigress and worked around through scattered brushwood to try to pick them up on the far side. The way round was longer than I had anticipated, and I eventually came out on an open stretch of ground with short grass and dotted about with big oak trees. Here I came to a halt in the shadow of a big tree. Presently, by a movement of this shadow, I realized that the tree above me was tenanted by a troop of langurs. I had covered a lot of ground during the 18 hours I had been on my feet that day, and here now was a safe place for me to rest a while, for the langurs above would give warning of danger. Sitting with my back against the tree and facing the cover round which I had skirted, I had been resting for half an hour when an old langur gave his alarm call. The tigress had come out into the open, and the langur had caught sight of her. Presently I too caught sight of the tigress just as she started to lie down. She was 100 yards to my right and 10 yards from the cover, and she lay down broadside to me with her head turned looking up at the calling langur. I have had a lot of practice in night shooting, for during the winter months I assisted our tenants at Kaladhungi to protect their crops against marauding animals such as pig and deer. On a clear moonlit night, I can usually count on hitting an animal up to a range of about 100 yards. Like most people who have taught themselves to shoot, I keep both eyes open when shooting. This enables me to keep the target in view with one eye while aligning the sights of the rifle with the other. At any other time, I would have waited for the tigress to stand up and then fired at her, but unfortunately my left eye was now closed, and 100 yards was too far to risk a shot with only one eye. On the 2 previous nights, the tigress had lain in the one spot that had possibly slept most of the night, and she might do the same now. If she lay right down on her side, she was now lying on her stomach with her head up, and when to sleep I could either go back to the cattle path in which I had left her pug marks and follow her tracks to the edge of the cover and get to within 10 yards of her, or I could creep up to her over the open ground until I got close enough to make sure of my shot. Anyway, for the present I could do nothing but sit perfectly still until the tigress made up her mind what she was going to do. For a long time, possibly half an hour or a little longer, the tigress lay in one position, occasionally moving her head from side to side, while the old langur in a sleepy voice continued to give his alarm call. Finally she got to her feet and very slowly and very painfully started to walk away to my right. Directly in the line in which she was going there was an open ravine 10 to 15 feet deep and 20 to 25 yards wide, which I had crossed lower down when coming to the spot where I was now. When the tigress had increased the distance between us to about 150 yards and the chances of her seeing me had decreased, I started to follow her. Slipping from tree to tree, and moving a little faster than she, I reduced her lead to 50 yards by the time she reached the edge of the ravine. She was now in range, but was standing in shadow, and her tail end was a very small mark to fire at. For a long and anxious minute she stood in the one position, and then, having made up her mind to cross the ravine, very gently went over the edge. As the tigress disappeared from view, I bent down and ran forward on silent feet. Bending my head down and running was a very stupid mistake for me to have made, and I had only run a few yards when I was overcome by vertigo. Near me were 2 oak saplings, a few feet apart and with interlaced branches. Laying down my rifle, I climbed up the saplings to a height of 10 or 12 feet. Here I found a branch to sit on, another for my feet, and yet another small branch for me to rest against. Crossing my arms on the branches in front of me, I laid my head on them, and at that moment the abscess burst, not into my brain as I feared it would, but out through my nose and left ear. No greater happiness can man know than the sudden cessation of great pain, was said by someone who had suffered and suffered greatly, and who knew the happiness of sudden relief. It was round about midnight when relief came to me, and the grey light was just beginning to show in the east when I raised my head from my crossed arms. Cramp in my legs resulting from my having sat on a thin branch for 4 hours had roused me, and for a little while I did not know where I was or what had happened to me. Realization was not long in coming. The great swelling on my head, face and neck had gone, and with it had gone the pain. I could now move my head as I liked, my left eye was open, and I could swallow without discomfort. I had lost an opportunity of shooting the tigress, but it did not matter now, for I was over my bad time, and no matter where or how far the tigress went, I would follow her, and sooner or later I would surely get another chance. When I last saw the tigress, she was heading in the direction of the village. Swinging down from the saplings, up which I had climbed with such difficulty, I retrieved my rifle and headed in the same direction. At the stream I stopped and washed and cleaned myself and my clothes as best as I could. My men had not spent the night in the village as I had instructed them to, but had sat around a fire near my tent, keeping a kettle of water on the boil. As dripping with water they saw me coming towards them, they sprang up with a glad cry of, "Sahib, Sahib, you have come back, and you are well." "Yes," I answered, "I have come back, and I am now well." When an Indian gives his loyalty, he gives it unstintingly and without counting the cost. When we arrived at Talla-Des, the headman put 2 rooms at the disposal of my men, for it was too dangerous to sleep anywhere except behind locked doors. On this my bad night, and fully alive to the danger, my men had sat out in the open in case they could be of any help to me, and to keep a kettle on the boil for my tea, if I should return. I cannot remember if I drank the tea, but I can remember my shoes being drawn off by willing hands and a rug spread over me as I lay down on my bed. Hours and hours of peaceful sleep, and then a dream. Someone was urgently calling me, and someone was as urgently saying I must not be disturbed. Over and over again the dream was repeated with slight variations, but with no less urgency, until the words penetrated through the fog of sleep and became a reality. "You must wake him, or he will be very angry." And the rejoinder, "We will not wake him, for he is very tired." Ganga Ram was the last speaker, so I called out and told him to bring the man to me. In a minute my tent was besieged by an excited throng of men and boys, all eager to tell me that the man-eater had just killed 6 goats on the far side of the village. While pulling on my shoes, I looked over the throng, and on seeing Dungar Singh, the lad who was with me when I shot the cubs, I asked him if he knew where the goats had been killed, and if he could take me to the spot. "Yes, yes," he answered eagerly, "I know where they were killed, and I can take you there." Telling the headman to keep the crowd back, I armed myself with my .275 rifle, and accompanied by Dungar Singh, set off through the village. My sleep had refreshed me, and as there was now no need for me to put my feet down gently to avoid jarring my head, I was able for the first time in weeks to walk freely and without discomfort. Part 9. The day I arrived at Talla-Des, Dungar Singh, the lad who was with me now, had taken me through the village to a narrow saddle from where there was an extensive view into two valleys. The valley to the right fell steeply away in the direction of the Kali River. At the upper end of this valley I had shot the cubs and wounded the tigress. The other valley, the one on the left, was less steep, and from the saddle a goat track ran down into it. It was in this valley that the goats had been killed. Down the goat track the lad now started to run, with me close on his heels. After winding down over steep and broken ground for 500 or 600 yards, the track crossed a stream and then continued down the valley on the left bank. Close to where the tracks crossed the stream there was an open bit of comparatively flat ground. Running from left to right across this open ground was a low ridge of rock, on the far side of which was a little hollow, and lying in the hollow were 3 goats. On the way down the hill the lad had told me that round about midday a large flock of goats in charge of 10 or 15 boys were feeding in the hollow, when a tiger, which they suspected was the man-eater, suddenly appeared among them and struck down 6 goats. On seeing the tiger the boys started yelling and were joined by some men collecting firewood nearby. In the general confusion of goats dashing about and human beings yelling, the tiger moved off, and no one appeared to have seen in which direction it went. Grabbing hold of 3 dead goats, the men and boys dashed back to the village to give me the news, leaving 3 goats with broken backs in the hollow. That the killer of the goats was the wounded man-eater, there could be no question, for when I last saw her the previous night she was going straight towards the village. Further, my men told me that an hour or so before my return to camp, a cocker had barked near the stream, 100 yards from where they were sitting, and thinking that the animal had barked on seeing me, they had built up the fire. It was fortunate that they had done so, for I later found the pug marks of the tigress where she had skirted round the fire and had then gone through the village, obviously with the object of securing a human victim. Having failed in her quest, she had evidently taken cover near the village, and at the first opportunity of securing food had struck down the goats. This she had done in a matter of seconds while suffering from a wound that made her limp badly. As I was not familiar with the ground, I asked Dungar Singh in which direction he thought the tigress had gone. Pointing down the valley, he said she had probably gone in that direction, for there was heavy jungle farther down. While I was questioning him about this jungle with the idea of going down and looking for the tigress, a colleague pheasant started chattering. On hearing this, the lad turned around and looked up the hill, giving me an indication of the direction in which the bird was calling. To our left, the hill went up steeply, and growing on it were a few bushes and stunted trees. I knew the tigress would not have attempted to climb this hill, and on seeing me looking at it, Dungar Singh said the pheasant was not calling on the hill, but in a ravine round the shoulder of it. As we were not within sight of the pheasant, there was only one thing that could have alarmed it, and that was the tigress. Telling Dungar Singh to leave me and run back to the village as fast as he could, I covered his retreat with my rifle until I considered he was clear of the danger zone, and then turned round to look for a suitable place in which to sit. The only trees in this part of the valley were enormous pines, which, as they had no branches for 30 or 40 feet, it would be quite impossible to climb. So, of necessity, I would have to sit on the ground. This would be all right during daylight, but if the tigress delayed her return until nightfall and preferred human flesh to mutton, I would need a lot of luck to carry me through the hour or 2 of darkness before the moon rose. On the low ridge running from left to right on the near side of the hollow was a big flat rock. Near it was another and smaller rock. By sitting on this smaller rock, I found I could shelter behind the bigger, exposing only my head to the side from which I expected the tigress to come. So here I decided to sit. In front of me was a hollow some 40 yards in width with a 20-foot high bank on the far side. Above this bank was a 10 to 20-yard wide flat stretch of ground sloping down to the right. Beyond this, the hill went up steeply. The 3 goats in the hollow, which were alive when the boys and men ran away, were now dead. When striking them down, the tigress had ripped the skin on the back of one of them. The colleague pheasant had now stopped chattering, and I speculated as to whether it had called at the tigress as she was going up the ravine after the lad and I had arrived, or whether it had called on seeing the tigress coming back. In the one case, it would mean a long wait for me, and in the other, a short one. I had taken up my position at 2 p.m., and half an hour later, a pair of blue Himalayan magpies came up the valley. These beautiful birds, which do a lot of destruction in the nesting season among tits and other small birds, have an uncanny instinct for finding in a jungle anything that is dead. I heard the magpies long before I saw them, for they are very vocal. On catching sight of the goats, they stopped chattering and very cautiously approached. After several false alarms, they alighted on the goat with the ripped back and started to feed. For some time, a king vulture had been quartering the sky, and now, on seeing the magpies on the goat, he came sailing down and landed as lightly as a feather on the dead branch of a pine tree. These king vultures, with their white shirt fronts, black coats, and red heads and legs, are always the first of the vultures to find a kill. Being smaller than other vultures, it is essential for them to be first at the table, for when the others arrive, they have to take a back seat. I welcomed the vulture's coming, for he would provide me with information I lacked. From his perch high up on the pine tree, he had an extensive view, and if he came down and joined the magpies, it would mean that the tigress had gone. On the other hand, if he remained where he was, it would mean that she was lying up somewhere close by. For the next half an hour, the scene remained unchanged. The magpies continued to feed, and the vulture sat on the dead branch, and then the sun was blotted out by heavy rain clouds. Shortly after, the colleague pheasant started chattering again, and the magpies flew screaming down the valley. The tigress was coming, and here, sooner than I had expected, was the chance of shooting her that I had lost the previous night when overcome by vertigo. A few light bushes on the shoulder of the hill partly obstructed my view in the direction of the ravine, and presently, through these bushes, I saw the tigress. She was coming very slowly along the flat bit of ground above the 20-foot high bank and was looking straight towards me. With only my head exposed and my soft hat pulled down to my eyes, I knew she would not notice me if I made no movement. So, with the rifle resting on the flat rock, I sat perfectly still. When she had come opposite to me, the tigress sat down with the bole of a big pine tree directly between us. I could see her head on one side of the tree and her tail and part of her hind quarters on the other. Here she sat for minutes, snapping at the flies that, attracted by her wound, were tormenting her. Part 10. 8 years previously, when the tigress was a comparatively young animal, she had been seriously injured in an encounter with a porcupine. At the time she received this injury, she may have had cubs, and unable for the time being to secure her natural prey to feed herself in order to nourish her cubs, she had taken to killing human beings. In doing this, she had committed no crime against the laws of nature. She was a carnivorous animal, and flesh, whether human or animal, was the only food she could assimilate. Under stress of circumstances, an animal, and a human being also, will eat food that under normal circumstances they are averse to eating. From the fact that during the whole of her man-eating career, the tigress had only killed 150 human beings, fewer than 20 people a year, I am inclined to think that she only resorted to this easily procured form of food when she had cubs and when, owing to her injury, she was unable to get the requisite amount of natural food needed to support herself and her family. The people of Talla-Des had suffered and suffered grievously from the tigress, and for the suffering she had inflicted she was now paying in full. To put her out of her misery, I several times aligned the sights of my rifle on her head, but the light, owing to the heavy clouds, was not good enough for me to make sure of hitting a comparatively small object at 60 yards. Eventually, the tigress stood up and took 3 steps, and then stood broadside onto me, looking down at the goats. With my elbows resting on the flat rock, I took careful aim at the spot where I thought her heart would be, and pressed the trigger. I saw a spurt of dust go up on the hill on the far side of her. On seeing the dust, the thought flashed through my mind that not only had I missed the tigress's heart, but that I had missed the whole animal. And yet, after my careful aim, that could not be. What undoubtedly had happened was that my bullet had gone clean through her, without meeting any resistance. At my shot, the tigress sprang forward, raced over the flat ground like a very frightened but unwounded animal, and before I could get in another shot, disappeared from view. Mad with myself for not having killed the tigress when she had given me such a good shot, I was determined now that she would not escape from me. Jumping down from the rock, I sprinted along across the hollow, up the 20-foot bank, and along the flat ground until I came to the spot where the tigress had disappeared. Here, I found there was a steep 40-foot drop down a loose shale scree. Down this the tigress had gone in great bounds. Afraid to do the same for fear of spraining my ankles, I sat down on my heels and tobogganed to the bottom. At the foot of the scree was a well-used footpath, along which I felt sure the tigress had gone, though the surface was too hard to show pug marks. To the right of the path was a boulder-strewn stream, the one that Dungar Singh and I had crossed farther up, and flanking the stream was a steep, grassy hill. To the left of the path was a hill with a few pine trees growing on it. The path for some distance was straight, and I had run along it for 50 or more yards when I heard a ghurl gave its alarm sneeze. There was only one place where the ghurl could be, and that was on the grassy hill to my right. Thinking that the tigress had possibly crossed the stream and gone up this hill, I pulled up to see if I could see her. As I did so, I thought I heard men shouting. Turning round, I looked up in the direction of the village and saw a crowd of men standing on the saddle of the hill. On seeing me look around, they shouted again and waved me on, straight along the path. In a moment I was on the run again, and on turning a corner found fresh blood on the path. The skin of animals is loose. When an animal that is standing still is hit in the body by a bullet, and it dashes away at full speed, the hole made in the skin does not coincide with the hole in the flesh, with the result that as long as the animal is running at speed, little if any blood flows from the wound. When, however, the animal slows down and the two holes come closer together, blood flows and continues to flow more freely the slower the animal goes. When there is any uncertainty as to whether an animal that has been fired at has been hit or not, the point can be very easily cleared up by going to the exact spot where the animal was when fired at and looking for cut hairs. These will indicate that the animal was hit, whereas the absence of such hairs will show that it was clean missed. After going round the corner, the tigress had slowed down, but she was still running, as I could see from the blood splashes, and in order to catch up with her, I put on a spurt. I had not gone very far when I came to spur, jutting out from the hill on my left. Here the path bent back at a very acute angle, and not being able to stop myself, and there being nothing for me to seize hold of on the hillside, I went over the edge of the narrow path all standing. 10 to 15 feet below was a small rhododendron sapling, and below the sapling a sheer drop into a dark and evil-looking ravine where the stream, turning at right angles, had cut away the toe of the hill. As I passed the sapling with my heels cutting furrows in the soft earth, I gripped it under my right arm. The sapling, fortunately, was not uprooted, and though it bent, it did not break. Easing myself round very gently, I started to kick footholds in the soft, loamy hill face, which had a luxuriant growth of maidenhair fern. The opportunity of catching up with the tigress had gone. But I now had a well-defined blood trail to follow, so there was no longer any need for me to hurry. The footpath, which at first had run north, now ran west along the north face of a steep and well-wooded hill. When I had gone for another 200 yards along the path, I came to flat ground on a shoulder of the hill. This was the limit I would have expected a tiger shot through the body to have travelled, so I approached the flat ground on which there was a very heavy growth of bracken and scattered bushes very, very cautiously. A tiger that has made up its mind to avenge an injury is the most terrifying animal to be met with in an Indian jungle. The tigress had a very recent injury to avenge, and she had demonstrated by striking down 6 goats and by springing and dashing away when I fired at her that the leg wound she had received 5 days before was no handicap to rapid movements. I felt sure, therefore, that as soon as she became aware that I was following her and she considered that I was within her reach, she would launch an all-out attack on me, which I would possibly have to meet with a single bullet. Drawing back the bolt of the rifle, I examined the cartridge very carefully, and satisfied that it was one of the fresh lot I had recently got from Manton in Calcutta, I replaced it in the chamber, put back the bolt, and threw off the safety catch. The path ran through the bracken, which was waist high, and which met over it. The blood trail led along the path into the bracken, and the tigress might be lying up on the path or on the right or on the left-hand side of it. So I approached the bracken foot by foot, and looking straight ahead, for on these occasions it is unwise to keep turning the head. And when I was within 3 yards of the bracken, I saw a movement a yard from the path on the right. It was the tigress gathering herself together for a spring. Wounded and starving though she was game to fight it out. Her spring, however, was never launched, for as she rose, my first bullet raked her from end to end, and the second bullet broke her neck. Days of pain and strain on an empty stomach left me now trembling in every limb, and I had great difficulty in reaching the spot where the path bent back at an acute angle, and where, but for the chance dropping of a rhododendron seed, I would have ended my life on the rocks below. The entire population of the village, plus my own men, were gathered on the saddle of the hill and on either side of it, and I had hardly raised my hat to wave when, shouting at the top of their voices, the men and boys came swarming down. My 6 Garhwalis were the first to arrive. Congratulations over, the tigress was lashed to a pole, and 6 of the proudest Garhwalis in Kumaon carried the Talla-Des Man-Eater in triumph to Talla-Kot village. Here, the tigress was laid down on a bed of straw for the women and children to see, while I went back to my tent for my first solid meal in many weeks. An hour later, with a crowd of people around me, I skinned the tigress. My first bullet, a .275 soft nose with a split nickel case fired on 7th of April, was bushed and firmly fixed in the ball and socket joint of the tigress's right shoulder. The second and third bullets, fired as she was falling through the air and climbing up the hill, had missed her. The fourth, fired on 12th of April, had gone clean through without striking any bones, and the fifth and the sixth had killed her. From her right foreleg and shoulder, I found some 20 porcupine quills, ranging in length from 2 to 6 inches, which were firmly embedded in muscle and were undoubtedly the cause of the tigress's having become a man-eater. I spent the following day in partly drying the skin, and 3 days later I was safely back in my house with my bad time behind me. Baines very kindly sent for Dungar Singh and his brother, and at a public function at Almora thanked them for their help they had given me and presented them with my token of gratitude. A week after my return to Nainital, Sir Malcolm Haley gave me an introduction to Colonel Dick, an ear specialist, who treated me for 3 months in his hospital in Lahore and restored my hearing sufficiently for me to associate with my fellow men without embarrassment, and gave me back the joy of hearing music and the song of birds. The End.